Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today is episode 4 and my top 5 writing tips. Today is about dialogue. Let's talk about it. Dialogue! We all do it, whether you're communicating through body language or you're actually speaking. It happens. It happens all the time. It happens quite frequently. And it happens in your book. Now, whenever you are having an actual conversational dialogue in your novel, you want the conversation to flow naturally, but if you think about it, we tend to throw in these little ums and uhs and likes in whenever we talk. I'll give you an example.
So I really like to read. Like it's really cool. It's like something that I really like to do.
Have you ever heard somebody like that? But in a book, we don't want to read that. You don't want to add those ums and ahs and little noises that we make in between. So that's one thing to do with your dialogue. Another thing to do with your dialogue is what tense is your story written in? First, second, third person limited, third person omniscient. Let me show you some examples of dialogue depending on what tense you're writing your story in. So let's set the scene a little bit. Say there's a couple people in a room and there is a hole in the wall. First person example. Hey, Mark, I said, how did the hole get here? Mark shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. It was here when I got here. An example of second person. My, you state to yourself, taking in the scene before you. Mark, how'd this hole get here? Mark replied, I don't know. It was here when I got here. An example of third person dialogue. Mark, do you know what happened? Sarah asked hesitantly. Mark shrugged and replied, I don't know. It was here when I got here. That was a basic scene with very basic dialogue. Do you want a more dynamic way to write your dialogue that appeals to a more mature audience? To do that, you're going to remove the he said, she said. Doing this is going to take some skill with structuring your scene and your character placement, but it's definitely doable. Let me show you some examples. With first person, I walked into the room and gasped at the scene before me. Mark, how did the hole get here? Mark shrugged his shoulders and looked back at the hole. I don't know. It was here when I got here. A second person, you walked into the room very quickly. You were surprised at the scene before you. Mark sat there looking at the hole. My. Mark, what happened? Mark continued to stare at the hole. I don't know. It was here when I got here. Third person example. Sarah walked quickly into the room and hesitated when she saw the gaping hole. Mark, do you know what happened? Mark was hesitant himself. I don't know. It was here when I got here. Do you see how that changed? Could you tell the difference? So you know who's speaking because of the character placement and the tone. Instead of saying directly, he said, she said. That's something we typically see in children's novels. And to mature your own writing and look as professional as possible, you got to do away with the he said, she said. I love a good scene structure and I love imagery, but there's something so inviting about turning a page and seeing some dialogue. You also want your dialogue to work for you. You want it to move your story along. You want to engage with your reader. And you also want it to provide some payoffs as well. To have an effective payoff, you don't want to be so much of a teller but a shower, which is kind of funny that we're talking about dialogue and I'm saying don't be a teller. What I mean by that, say that there's a dialogue happening between two characters and one of them says, hey, how are you feeling? I know yesterday you were super sick and we were all really worried about you. Where were you? The other character says, I really don't want to talk about that. You just said everything. There's no real payoff because you already know. And in my opinion, every good book is a mystery in the sense that There are payoffs that you have to wait for a little bit, and it's a mystery because you're figuring out what's going to happen in your story, and dialogue helps with that. So here's an example of how to do that correctly. Say that there's two characters, and one of them says, "Hey, are you okay?" The other one butts in going, "I don't want to talk about it." You're wondering now, like, what do they want to talk about? What's this big thing going on? And I used a really simple example, but it can be for really big topics in your story. So to use it for a bigger subject, you would put it in just how I showed the second time, where someone goes to mention it and the second person is like, whoa, no, 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 no. Or however else you go about doing it. That was just a simple example. If you're talking about it in the book, then you know that these characters are going to bring it back up later. That's where the payoff happens. Why else would it be there if it wasn't going to be brought back up later? A cool thing to use in your dialogue is subtext. Now, there's a beautiful illustration of it in this book that I cannot remember the name of, but it was so good. And the husband had an affair. The wife knew about it, and they were standing in the kitchen, and he spilt some wine that stained the counter, and he quickly put his hand on it to cover it up. The wife came over and put her hand on his and said, "It's okay, we can get this figured out." You just know they're not talking about the wine on the cabinet. They're talking about the affair. Something else you can do with dialogue is sidestepping. I'm sure you've seen it in your life. You ask someone a question or you try to get to know them and they just don't say a single thing. And if they do, they say something else. And you kind of have to decipher, well, what do you mean? I asked this and you said this. How does this tie into what I just asked? And it would create a really interesting dynamic between two characters that might be button heads a little bit. Now, you can also include your dialect in your dialogue. In my opinion, I would only add just like a little bit. That way, it's not too much. I've tried reading some books where they really try to incorporate the dialect, and you have a hard time reading it. It's hard to understand. For example, if you had a southerner say, "Ain't that the truth, honey?" Instead of saying, "Isn't that the truth, honey?" Say this character just came on the scene and they said that. You instantly know they're from the South. They have an accent, and you even read the accent probably in your head. Hopefully, you liked the change of background. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, follow, heart, comment below. Love hearing from you. Really hope this was helpful. Keep an eye out for my final in this series of my top 5 writing tips. And you heard it here first. There's a surprise at the end of that video. Bye-bye.